Hello there, my name is Russell Kilbourne. I'm going to move my script so I can see it here. And I am the Chair of English and Film Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. I want to welcome all of you, and there are quite a few of you, to the second of 4 events in the Roundtable series, Posthumanism, Cinema Media Philosophy. Tonight's event, of course, is titled Posthuman Games for Posthuman Players, Non-Human Game Spaces, Assets, and Interfaces. This series, I should add, is made possible by SSHRC, the Posthumanist Research Institute at Brock University, Wilfrid Laurier's Faculty of Arts, and the Department of English and Film Studies. So we would like to thank all of these folks for their support. Before we say anything more, though, about posthumanism or games or anything else, I would like to introduce the moderator for this evening's roundtable. That's Melissa Brennan. Melissa is a PhD student in English and Film Studies here at Laurier. And together with our Brantford colleague, Sandra Danilovich, who you'll be meeting shortly, the two of them are responsible for conceiving and organizing this event. So I will hand it over to you, Melissa.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and I'm so glad you guys could all join us tonight. So I'm going to be your moderator, comic relief, hopefully host, and someone to make this evening a fun discussion on games and posthumanism. In a moment, Dr. Kilbourne is going to introduce our presentation by Dr. Katherine Hayles. And following that, we're going to have a Q&A over or after her discussion. But following that, we have some excellent panelists also contributing to tonight's conversation. And that's going to be Lynn Hughes, Kara Stone, Sandra Danilovich, and I will close out the evening with some thoughts from more of the gamer than posthuman side, but hopefully we'll be able to have something to talk about. So all that being said, I'll turn it back over to Russell to introduce Dr. Hayles for tonight.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I don't know if Dr. Hayles needs a big introduction, but I'm going to do this anyway. Our special guest and first presenter, as you know, is N. Katherine Hayles, Distinguished Research Professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the James B. Duke Professor Emerita from Duke University. Professor Hayles' research focuses on the relations of literature, science, and technology in the 20th and 21st centuries. In addition to over 100 peer-reviewed articles, her many books include Postprint, Books in Becoming Computational from 2021, Unthought, The Power of the Cognitive Non-Conscious from 2017, and How We Think, Digital Media and Contemporary Technogenesis from 2015. Professor Hayles' books have won several prizes, including the René Wellick Award for the Best Book in Literary Theory for 1999's How We Became Posthuman, Virtual Bodies in Literature, Cybernetics, and Informatics, a groundbreaking book that stands as a foundational text for posthumanist studies. She has garnered numerous fellowships and awards, including 2 National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowships, a Guggenheim, a Rockefeller Residential Fellowship at Bellagio in Italy, and 2 University of California Presidential Research Fellowships. She's also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Hayles is currently at work on a new book titled Technosymbiosis, Futures of the Human. So now, in our initial email exchange, Professor Hayles informed me that she's not really into games and gaming. On the other hand, as most of you are probably aware, Professor Hayles has given a good deal of thought to the nature of human-computer interactions. In fact, for many of us, myself included, it's through her work that we first became aware of the concept and the term of the posthuman or posthumanism. In fact, as mentioned, Professor Hayles recently finished a new book on the dismantling of anthropocentrism, which is also one possibility, as she points out, for games that feature non-human players and adversaries. So today, before we launch into our discussion of games and gaming in the context of critical posthumanism, we're extremely fortunate to have Professor Hayles here to be our guide in this investigation. We will have, as Melissa explained, 4 presentations this evening, beginning with Professor Hayles, who's also agreed to be the primary interlocutor for the other 3 presenters, sort of leading off any discussion to follow each of the other presentations. So to begin with, Professor Hayles will prepare the ground. Her presentation today is titled Deconstructing Anthropocentrism Through Cognitive Assemblages, and I will let her tell you what this means. Professor Hayles.
Thank you, Professor Kilborn, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. This is an instance of me rushing in where angels fear to tread, since I know very little about computer games, but I know something about posthumanism, so that will be the gist of my comments today. So I'll do a screen share, and then we'll get started. So as Russell mentioned, my focus here will be on deconstructing anthropocentrism, which I regard as a project of the first importance. The promise of the posthuman, I think, can be summarized fairly easily, and that is partly as a result of the new technologies that we have been developing in the latter half of the 20th century and the 21st century. Enlightenment versions of the human are crumbling. So those versions included the idea of a person as a rational actor, possessing free will, able to engage in free market enterprises, and with rights of citizenship in the nation and so forth. And as the whole idea of artificial intelligence is now beginning to undercut some of those ideas, and as a great deal of research has illustrated, humans are far from rational actors in many instances. New versions of what the human is and what it may mean are now becoming possible. So by anthropocentrism, I mean the illusion that humans are at the center of this world, that humans have the right to dominate all other species and exploit Earth's resources for their own use. And as we know, we're now facing multiple environmental crises as a result, I think, of these premises playing themselves out in the real world. So that, for me, is why it's so important to deconstruct anthropocentrism. Lisa Lowe, in her recent book, The Intimacies of Four Continents, goes on to connect anthropocentrism with liberal political philosophy, arguing that liberal political philosophy, despite its promises, failed to make good on them in a number of instances. So looking at archival documents from roughly the period 1750 to 1850, she identified the promises of political liberalism as universal rights, emancipation, wage labor, and free trade, among other attributes. But in fact, as she pointed out, liberalism defined the human and universalized its attributes to the European man. It simultaneously differentiated populations in the colonies as less than human. And a compelling example she uses, from my point of view, is John Stuart Mill, who at the same decade he was penning his famous pamphlet on liberty, was also writing missives as an apologist for the East Indian Company. So Lowe argues that the relationship between colonial oppression and liberal philosophy was causal, not merely correlative. And she makes the point that at this time in history, economics functioned as a zero-sum game, that the leisure of some classes necessitated the enslavement or indentured status of other people. And certainly in the US history, we see a lot of examples of that. Slavery in the plantation system, for example, or indentured Chinese working at the expansion of railroads in the American West. So my question is, can the problem posed by liberal philosophy be solved in another way, by another set of premises? Is the situation still a zero-sum game? I think we have reason to believe that the situation has changed in ways that makes that no longer true. As we know, there have been huge advances in computational media, and increasingly technical media, computational media take over as some of the labor resources that enslaved and indentured people did previously. So political liberalism defined the human through property relations. As C.B. Macpherson pointed out in his book, now 6 decades old, on possessive individualism, he mentions this famous quote by John Locke: each man has a property in his own person, and because each man owns himself, he's therefore able to sell his labor to others and get the goods he needs to live. But I think these premises now are outmoded, and that it's possible to think about new premises that will lead us to different kinds of conclusions. So in my recent work, I've been focusing on what these new premises might be that point toward a different kind of worldview. So to start from a foundational observation, all organisms receive information from their environment. They interpret that information and they create responses to it. And that is precisely how I define cognition. That cognition is the process of interpreting information in contexts that connect it with meaning. So as a result, we can conclude that all organisms have cognitive capabilities, even those without brains or central nervous systems, such as the banana plants that you see here. Now, the next piece of this new worldview comes into view through biosemiotics, which is the science of signs for non-human organisms. So biosemioticians argue that all biological organisms participate in sign creation and engage in meaning-making practices specific to their capabilities and milieu. So for example, if a deciduous tree drops its leaves in winter as the temperatures fall, that's a response to an environmental signal forged through eons of evolutionary adaptation of the organism to its environment. And biosemioticians define that as a meaning-making practice because it has meaning for the organism. By the same token, I also argue that computational media also have cognitive capabilities, that computers interpret information and connect it to meanings relevant to their internal, and if they have sensors attached to them, their external milieu. Now, the classic argument against this idea is John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment, in which he imagines a man in a room, doesn't know Chinese, can't speak Chinese. Someone slips a string of Chinese characters through a slot in the door. The man uses a rule book to compose a reply and slips his new string back through the door. And the interlocutor outside is convinced that this is evidence that the man knows Chinese, but of course, according to Searle, he knows nothing of the sort. And the man here stands for the computer. So the computer simply matches patterns, but it has no idea of any meaning of those patterns. Well, I think we can deconstruct this thought experiment by focusing on its anthropocentrism, because Searle, in effect, is demanding that what the computer does has meaning only if it's the same kind of meaning that a human would give to it. But computers, in fact, generate meanings within their own processes, their hardwire code connecting to their memory, connecting to their output, and so forth. So within their context, they do generate meanings and interpret information. So when humans, non-humans, and computational media interact with each other, they create what I call cognitive assemblages, collectivities through which information, interpretations, and meanings circulate. And most of the world's work today is done through these kinds of cognitive assemblages, because computational media have interpenetrated into all manner of electromechanical systems as controllers and interpreters of information. And so, yes, the electromechanical devices do the work, but that work is mediated through the computational media that are interpreting the information. So the electrical grid, the water system, transport systems, air traffic control, on and on and on, all operate as cognitive assemblages. So this requires then that we rethink human agency, that cognition, agency, and decision-making are all distributed in cognitive assemblages. So this makes more or less obsolete the notion of a human operating with free will, because that agency and decision-making has already been distributed through a whole array of computational devices. Now, if we now get to the matter at hand, posthumanism and computer games, I confess that I had never thought about this relation until Russell invited me to participate here. But the minute he articulated that connection for me, I could see its relevance. So in computer games, there are non-anthropomorphic characters, and to the extent that players participate in those, they are already subverting some anthropocentric assumptions. Computer games could be the absolute perfect example of cognitive assemblages, because they involve humans, sometimes they involve non-human characters, and of course they always involve computational media. So in these games, the computer serves as antagonist, collaborator, but here's a new idea, also serves as symbiotic partner. So symbiosis is defined in biological terms as two species living in close proximity to one another that become dependent on each other through their interactions. So the encounters staged in computer games, in fact, symbolize for us our interaction with computers in the real world. And because we are engaged in deep technosymbiosis with computational media, that means that computers and their artifacts have an effect on us, because it's a truism for anthropologists that the tools we make us. For example, anthropologists now argue that bipedalism, the evolution of bipedalism for Homo sapiens, was accelerated by the development of tools, because it allowed tools to be fabricated and carried. And the fabrication of tools bestowed such survival advantage that in turn, it accelerated the development of bipedalism. So you get these kind of feedback loops through the fabrication of tools, which turn back to change cognitive structures of humans, along with many other things. So designing a game then is also an indirect way to design the game players. That in a nutshell is what I mean by technosymbiosis. So with that, I'll conclude my preliminary remarks. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to discussion with you. Thank you. See if I can stop screen share here.
That was actually really interesting. I'm very glad that we're kind of two sides of the same coin, where I think maybe in my discussion later, there'll be a little bit more examples where I'm taking the opportunity to ask a professional their posthumous response on it. So just in case anyone wasn't here earlier, you can use the Q&A in chat. And submit any of your questions there. Also, I certainly invite the other panelists to start off the discussion if they would like. Anyone has any questions, comments they're burning to start with, while Q&A starts to warm up.
Melissa, may I ask a question?
Sure, Russ.
It's too difficult to type it all down. If I could just speak, that would be, thank you. Professor Hayles, this is something that I often wonder about when I read critical posthumanist theory, and a number of things you said, you just spoke about, touch on this. Start my video now, I've been allowed. And it's just a basic question. If we give or gift certain kinds of capabilities or capacities to non-human beings or even to machines, as in some of your examples, how is this not still a form of anthropomorphism, if not anthropocentrism? So, for example, the notion of biosemiotics and meaning making. When does it stop being about us?
Yeah, thank you, Russell. That's a great question. And I'd like to distinguish here between anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism. We cannot avoid being anthropomorphic because we're human. So we see with human eyes, we think with human brains, and that defines us as a species. But I think that we can, if not avoid anthropocentrism entirely, certainly damp it down considerably. So you might, I guess you could argue that biosemioticians are still anthropocentric to the extent that they think signs are important, they think meanings are important, and certainly that derives from human culture, because humans are the sign creators par excellence. But nevertheless, by opening the whole regime of signs to non-human organisms, they're positioning humans in a different way than if we thought that humans were the only creatures that could create signs and generate meanings. So we cease to be the sole purveyors of meaning-making practices, and instead we now take our place with a whole array of other organisms, and it's no longer human rationality that is considered to be prima facie superior, but rather a comparison of different cognitive capabilities, human capabilities, but in comparison with the cognitive capabilities of an oak tree, of a whale, of a clam, and so forth. So it's not just human rationality. So it's the relationality that is introduced by a field like biosemiotics that I think is a powerful antidote to anthropocentrism, because it makes us question those traditional assumptions that humans are prima facie superior to all other species.
Thank you very much. That really helps a lot, actually. That's been bothering me. I think there's a question or two in the chat. Thank you.
Oh, I see the issue. We've got a little bit of confusion about the chat. I may just turn that on if it's easier for people to use chat, or if the Q&A function is not working on some of the later versions of Zoom. In the chat, there similar discussion to what Russell just mentioned. David is suggesting that he's very fascinated by the idea of biosemiotics, especially as it underpins the cognitive assemblages. Maybe he feels he's asking kind of a similar question, but in terms of anthropocentrism, doesn't the idea of cognitive assemblages remain fundamentally anthropocentric? I think you kind of maybe mentioned how it may be impossible to avoid one.
Well, no, I would not agree that cognitive assemblages remain primarily anthropocentric, because the whole idea of cognitive assemblage is that we're not talking any longer about intelligence. Of course, there's a huge discourse about artificial intelligence. And as soon as you evoke intelligence, you sort of import the assumption that humans are the most intelligent species. But when you talk about cognition and cognitive capacities, you're then able to compare the cognitive capacities of humans with the cognitive capacities of other creatures and with the cognitive capacities of computers. So snakes, for example, can see in the infrared, humans can't. And there are many other instances. Dogs hear frequencies that humans can't hear. Dogs have incredible scent capacities that humans don't have, and so on and so forth. So it becomes, again, a matter of relationality between humans, between non-humans, and between computational media. So artificial intelligence is kind of blurs the line between human, what we might call human intelligence, and computational intelligence. That's why I prefer the term cognition. So when you ask about computer cognitions, again, what you're doing is comparing the kind of cognitions that humans have with the kind of cognitions that computers have. So at present, humans have a much more comprehensive worldview than any computational system does. On the other hand, computational systems can work much faster than human brains and then find subtle patterns in vast data sets and so on and so forth. So you have a means by which you can compare computational cognition with human cognition. It's not a simple comparison. Obviously, there are areas of strengths in human cognition, there are areas of strength in computational cognition, but what you get out of that is a very nuanced array of different kinds of parameters through which these comparisons can be made. So I would disagree that it's primarily anthropocentric. In fact, we know that most of the communication now going through the internet is not between machines and humans or humans and humans, it's between machines and machines. So if you just go by sheer volume of information being transmitted and received, it's exactly not anthropocentric, it's computer-centric. And of course, we know that there are 7.6 billion humans on the planet, but Cisco estimates that the Internet of Things already has something like 21 billion things connected to it. And it's supposed to rise to something like 50 billion things by 2025. So no, I would not say that's anthropocentric at all.
Thank you very much. We've actually well, we have some time for some questions in chat from the Q&A. Go. Question regarding technosymbiosis, and wondering to what extent this relationship between the human, non-human, and computational media can be considered a form of parasitism, where the account among these bodies is not mutually reinforcing. Also following here, I'm positioning the human as the default aggressor.
Okay, well, thank you for that question. It gives me an opportunity to clarify this. Symbiosis in a biological context usually carries a positive connotation, but in fact, technically speaking, it does include parasitism, where the mutual relationship benefits only one of the species to the detriment of the other. And we know from our many, many dystopian narratives about computational media enslaving humans or exterminating humans and so forth, that parasitism is an actual possibility. And in fact, people who are trying to predict the future of artificial intelligence, like Nick Bostrom, do postulate that by the mid-21st century, researchers may succeed in creating in general artificial intelligence. And he underscores, and of course I agree with this, no one really knows what will happen if such a general artificial intelligence emerges. And so it is a real risk. Yes, parasitism does exist. Parasitism is also a real risk. Right now, I don't think that's primarily the case, although people who are worried about algorithmic governmentality would argue that much of human labor is now directed toward providing material for the algorithms to process. And so I think you could define that as a form of parasitism. But it's also obvious that we benefit enormously from computational media, so much that if a high altitude electromagnetic pulse blast happened in the US and disabled our computational media, our entire society would be thrown into chaos. So just to think about that possibility sort of illustrates how deeply we do depend on computational media, even at the present.
Thank you so much. I'm noticing in chat people are very much appreciating your answer. I am reading them out of the Q&A bubble down at the bottom. If you happen to see a little red 2, you can actually read out the people that are giving you a full list, or I can continue to pass them along to you if you'd like.
Well, it's most convenient for me, Melissa, if you do pass it on to me. It allows me to focus a little bit more.
No problem. The next question we have, Christine Daigle. Thank you for your recent book, which I found incredibly thought-provoking. Would you say that there is a vibrancy and agent capacity to cognitive assemblages that far exceeds our human perspective? If so, how do we deal with our own insertion into these assemblages or potential exclusion?
Yeah, that's a great question, because by even defining cognitive assemblage, I'm more or less assuming an exterior viewpoint from which I can look at cognitive assemblages. But one could argue, as Louisa Moore does in a recent book, Cloud Ethics, that we're already always within algorithmic systems, that all of us in one form or another have contributed data that these algorithms work on. Maybe we visited a website, maybe it was scraped somewhere, but somewhere we're in there in those data sets. And to that extent, we are already implicated in algorithmic systems. So in that sense, there is no exterior viewpoint from which to observe. But I would also say that in my view, most people are less aware of being in a cognitive assemblage than is actually the case. That most people don't think much about where they get their electricity from, for example, or most people don't think a lot about the fact that the computer in their car is what allows the car to start. And if the computer doesn't recognize certain parameters, you can't start your car. And most people don't think about the fact that computational media are absolutely essential for air travel, not only in air traffic control, but also in the airplane itself. So I think our awareness of operating within cognitive assemblages is somewhat dampened by I'll call it the illusion of human autonomy. We envision ourselves as autonomous beings. We can decide what we want to do today, whether we're going to leave the house or whether we're going to stay at home, whether we're going to go to the store, and so on and so forth. But all of those activities, it turns out, are facilitated by cognitive assemblages in which we are already participating, even though we may not know it. So yeah, I would agree that that we're not as aware of being in a cognitive assemblage as we actually are. And I think it would be salutary if people were more aware of that, because it would make us more able to think coherently about our relationship with computational media and where we would like that to go.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comment on people being aware of necessarily being a part of one. To take it kind of back to gaming, it's almost like a consensual escape sometimes to go to a world that is very different. Laws of physics, laws of rules, but you kind of have to navigate your round around that, you navigate your way through that assemblage, or you don't get very far in the game at all. We have one more question from Garrett. I'm curious about your take on Karl Marx's point that our external environment, tools, nature, resources, etc., are the extension of our human essence, and how would that interplay with technosymbiosis? How it affects the human essence, species-being, or to use Marxian terminology?
Well, I'm not sure that I agree that our environment is an extension of the human essence. In fact, I'm not really comfortable with the idea of a human essence at all. I would be much more comfortable with the idea of species capabilities and species specificity. And it seems to me a kind of epitome of anthropocentrism to think that our environment is an extension of the human essence, because all around us every day, other organisms are living their lives. The worms are digging through the earth, the birds are doing their thing with only minimal consciousness of the human world as it imposes on them. And each of those creatures is as dedicated to its life world as we are to our life world. So who are we to say that our life world matters more than all of the other creatures on this planet? So, I read somewhere the statistics of what percentage of the planet's biomass humans comprise. It's a small percentage. It's like 5%. 95% of the rest of the planet's biomass are all going about their lives intent on doing what they're doing. And by what right would the 5% claim that all the other 95% are somehow subordinate or less important than we are?
I very much agree. Thankfully, I'm just noticing the time. I'm a bit keeping on track here, but we have one last question. And if anyone has any more questions, you will have several times this evening to pose some more specific gaming or post-human questions to the rest of the panelists and Dr. Hale. But we have one more from Richard. Thanking you so much. And inquiring, are people and societies in poor, underdeveloped, and developing countries more independent of cognitive assemblages? Free from independent? I'm not sure if it was right.
Yeah, I believe that is correct, but I would modify that a little bit and say people in developing and undeveloped nations are much less dependent on computational media. They are involved in cognitive assemblages, but those cognitive assemblages may involve plants and water buffalo and carts and things like that. So not so much computational media. And my comments about being involved with computational media and our dependence on them, really, I should have noted, apply to developed countries. I'm sure there are tribal regions in Africa where if all the computers in the world crashed, the effect on them would be minimal. So yeah, thank you for that contribution and for clarifying that aspect.
Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone who submitted some Q&As, and looking forward to talking with you some more. But since we'll be asking Dr. Hale's comments, I'm sure, much more this evening, give her a much deserved break, and I'll switch and introduce our next panelist for the evening. So we're very happy to have Lynn Hughes, who is a professor emerita at the Department of Studio Arts in Concordia. She's also been instrumental in the concept, structuring, and funding of Hexagram, as well as more recently, the Institute for Art, Culture, and Technology at Concordia. Her work explores the area between participatory theater, games, and new media. And we are very excited to hear what she has to share with us this evening. So take it away, Lynn.
I'm very happy to be here. Everybody can hear me. Sounds okay? Yes. So I'm in Montreal, Tiohtià:ke, on unceded Indigenous lands. And I just want to thank everybody who organized this panel. A wonderful talk from Katherine. I'm very excited to be part of the panel. Found and avatars apart, the question of the emancipatory potential of technology and of video games is a fraught one. I'm currently writing a non-academic book on AI for use initially with high school students in Northern Quebec. And I track, think about, make, and play games as my core practice. But I'll describe my reasons for moving into games and how I see my practice in this arena now. In my case, there's been a lot of other water under the bridge before I came to games. Up until about 2000, for many years before that, I was a visual artist, mostly a painter. And I'm not going to talk about that, although I think there's interesting ways to connect it to what I'm doing now. Just skip this bit a bit. Okay, so around the year 2000, a move out of painting had been happening gradually for me for a long time. I knew I needed to leave the contemplative, almost monastic studio environment, and I made a symbolic break in the mid-90s by taking a graduate degree in the history and philosophy of science and technology, mostly concentrated on the history and philosophy of mathematics. I did this to reconnect to the contemporary world and to understand how science and technology had shaped the culture and was continuing to shape the culture in the society I found myself in, but also crucially to reconnect to other people and to shift to collaborative processes and works. The earliest interactive digital work I produced was called Perversely Interactive System. It was a biofeedback piece about controlling technology through stillness in the body, about getting what you want by letting go, I guess. But this work still required staring at a screen, which I realized was rather like looking at a painting. In some significant sense, it was still in 2D. So I began to work collaboratively towards games that implicated whole bodies playing together in space in the round. I set myself the short-term goal, I guess, of making digital games without screens. An example of this was Propinquity, which was a collaboration with Bart Simon and Jane Tingley, and was about playing together using proximity sensors placed on the players' bodies. More recently, Alt-Ego, which was a collaboration with Kaho Abe and a small team, returned to the idea of agency via stillness or apparent passivity rather than visible action, this time without a screen. I'm not sure how successful this piece was on a number of levels, but I'm going to show a video of it. It's kind of a video teaser. I'll just say that Alt-Ego is a gloss on a traditional game form with attack and defense turns, and it also deliberately uses conventional video game controllers. But the interaction interface is otherwise all done through lights and some sound. The real power in the game comes from the avatar's ability to deliver through stillness and interior focus through the biofeedback interface. So I'll just switch to sharing screen. A little bit slow, sorry about this. Here we go. Okay.
Welcome, warriors. Prepare yourselves mentally and physically for the skill test in the battle to follow.
Welcome, players. Meet your avatars.
So the point of this is really the contrast between the kind of action and agency in the conventional battle games and what I wanted to say about different types of agency. So my current project, again with Bart Simon, and this time with Jody Allen and others, is part of a SSHRC grant called Sustaining Liveness in Participatory Experiences. It's even more about collaboration and context and less tech development heavy. And the idea is to look at the very, very compelling ground between interactive theater, games, and LARPing. So LARPing, many of you will know, is live action role-playing games that are done without actors, done usually by communities. For a particular sub-project in this larger project, we're developing a game experience that will take place in parallel to a real market, within a real market. It focuses on things and stories, the lives of things and economies of stories and relationships. And one of the core ideas here is to create game situations within real world ones, where the game is open and vulnerable to being interrupted at any moment by other than the game. In short, it's open to types of emergence. The use of the word participatory is partly about resisting the word immersion. And I feel there's a thread with the term immersion that has signposted this very windy journey of mine. During my visual arts practice and teaching, it was obvious to me and everyone around me that immersion indicated a situation in which the whole body was completely implicated. It was about swimming, if you like. When I moved into games, I spent some time feeling quite confused when people talked about immersion, until I realized it was being used in the opposite way, to mean a state of purely psychological and emotional immersion. Now in the arena of interactive theater, it is too often about glitzy events with tech-based sensory overload, the worst of both worlds, perhaps. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm very actively interested in a rather detailed understanding of AI and engaging with it for all kinds of reasons, not least because it is here and it will increasingly be pervasive. I'm trying to imagine interesting spaces for and uses of AI in games. So I hope the discussion here will help me think further about this. But at the moment, what I find compelling and promising about contemporary games is not the big commercial productions deploying, and that's the word, AI, where it's usually to boost an all too anthropocentric realism or to keep players immersed in playing as long as possible. But rather, I'm interested in the more independent, brilliant, and sometimes quirky designers, studios, and labels exploring more experimental avenues. Collectives or groups like Ice Water Games, which Kara is associated with, or Glow Up Studio, or somebody like David O'Reilly, as well as others making games about materiality and about other relationships, designers, artists, coders, squirreling, queering, witching, and renewing play, creating games for plants or exploring vibration as a communicative mode, or finding ways to play about and through, for example, anxiety, radical non-binarity, or indigenous future imaginaries and ways of knowing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was actually super interesting. Makes me very excited about conversations we can hopefully have about the idea of kind of playing with those different sort of interfaces and the different creation or haptic enjoyment you can get from not just doing something stationary, but also enjoying a little bit of motion too. I see we have Katherine Hayles joining us, and if she would like to start off the conversation, and any of the other panelists, I'd welcome comments when she's finished. Katherine?
Well, thank you, Len. That was fascinating. So I've been trying to figure out how I would define artificial intelligence, especially since the corporations that produce games and produce other kinds of software keep calling their agents intelligent. So it seems like artificial intelligence is a kind of ballooning term encompassing more and more. But for my purposes, I like to think of artificial intelligence as a system that can learn and evolve. And I wonder if you yourself have created such a game, or if you have comments on games that involve this facility.
So no, I haven't worked directly with artificial intelligence, but I've thought a lot about it. It's something that yes, it's just one of the things I think about. And I certainly think about it in other games and think about how it's being used. So generally speaking, in the big commercial games, and unfortunately, those are the games that most of the general public really seems to be incredibly ignorant of games apart from the big commercial games, which is very disappointing. I constantly come up against this. And in those games, generally speaking, AI, it's kind of AI light. It's often talked about as if it's AI. It's not the kind of AI that we think of in more academic circles or even in more experimental circles, artistic circles, for example, where people are not always, but sometimes trying to really use more radical versions of AI where there's more emergence. The AI that's used in these games is really used, for me, for two things. One is to exacerbate realism, anthropocentric kind of views of progress through the game, they're superficially post-human in terms of content often. So they'll often be about augmentation, about life forms that don't look human or radically augmented. But in fact, in the end, it's all centered on very anthropocentric view of how a human seeing the world and moving through the world, progressing through the world. And so that for me is very disappointing. It doesn't have to be that way, it just very often is. And so often when people refer to post-humanism in games, they're talking about this kind of superficial content that's about augmenting kind of heroic humans in the games as they progress through games. As I say, I think there are other ways. There are people who are more independent or just different, trying to do very different things, and they're not always super successful. I think still there is a reliance for reasons that have to do with games, which are something we will probably get into, what it means to have a games experience that you can understand. It's very hard to have any kind of radical emergence, so to use AI in some kind of a way where the AI is really kind of a radical version of it. But at the same time, I think even the content could be much more interesting. So, while on that level of being part of a computational cognitive assemblage, that's operating underneath. Unfortunately, often the message that's being delivered on the surface through the narrative is just the wrong one, as far as I'm concerned. But there are people, as I say, who are trying all kinds of other things, and I just wish they were better known and more played. And there are some absolutely wonderful things out there. They tend to still be on the level of narrative, at least to some extent, to a great extent, because it's hard to play a game where real AI is operating, I guess. The other thing that bothers me at the moment about AI in games is the way in which they manage time. So, when I think about post-human wishes, post-human effort, I guess, the sort of the idea for me of trying to think about slide modes or cephalopods or rocks, or all of this has to do with slowing down and has to do with a sense of time that is very difficult for us and is very different for us. And what I find in many, many games is that they're not, again, it's difficult in games, but it's not impossible, that they're not trying to deal with a different type of time. They're instead investing, in this, what I think of as adrenaline time. And that for me is not the kind of time that's going to connect us to trees and slime molds or whatever other things we want to be connected to. Anyway, I'm sorry about the long, rambling answer.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. No, that's very illuminating.
I'm sure other people will have many things to say about it, so it's just like a first pebble in the pool.
Out of curiosity, you mentioned there are examples of these games. Do you have like maybe a couple titles or something that pops to mind of people who are trying to do something sort of different?
There are lots of things out there, so I just tried mentioning, just because if you start mentioning lots of things, it's, you know, I hope that actually everybody else on the panel will mention things. So I certainly think that the label, I don't want to call it a label. Kara can tell us what it's sort of like between a collective and a label and a group of artists who are working under the name of Ice Water Games. There's some very interesting things that they're doing. Kara is among them. I think I mentioned Glow Up, which is just a very much more diversified team doing different sorts of things. That's maybe not, well, it's different. Yeah. And David O'Reilly's game, so Mountain, which has been made fun of actually, but some people love Mountain. It's a game where there's just a mountain. Anyway, you'll have to go and try it. And his other game, Everything. Everything, there was a very good review in the Atlantic of Everything by Ian Bogost, where he talks about the ways in which it's not completely successful. In everything you play, you can play as everything in the world. You can play as, and at every scale. So it's an absolutely amazing thing to have attempted to do. And there's some very odd, wonderful things in it. You know, a lot of if you're a cow or many things, you tumble, you don't walk. So it doesn't have that kind of realistic AI either. But you can be everything from the galaxy, you know, a galaxy to a cell and everything in between. And it's very quirky, the game, and huge and strange. And what Ian Boga says is that in some ways, it's that oddness that makes it so successful. But I think that would be one that I would suggest. But I hope that other panels will fill in lots of other things. Other panels will fill in other things.
Thank you so much. We do have one question that popped up in Q&A, which I feel like might want to answer now before we shift over. From Sandra Annetz, my professors, and full disclosure, my supervisor. She's wonderful. Wonderful talk. I wonder if you've heard of the new media artist, Lu Yang. She's done some work that seems similar, like the video game parody Uterus Man, the music video Brain Control Messenger, and where the actress wore a galvanic vestibular simulation device that let you manually control her own sense of balance with a joystick. How else can gaming engage directly with the body or sensory experience to queer how we know or feel things?
Well, that is a great question. I wish I'd thought about talking about Lu Yang, but I'm trying to talk about games and not about art. Like, I'm quite comfortable talking about digital art because there's a whole other side of things that go on for me in digital art. And so Lu Yang is somebody I know personally really well, and I've been over to see her in China and stuff a couple of times. Yes, actually that Uterus Man is one of my absolute favorite animated propositions. I can't say much more about it. You have to go and have a look at it. I think something that people often don't know about it that I find just interesting is that, you know, Lu Yang is Chinese, and it's kind of taking its cue from the aesthetics of Japanese animation. So in China, it's not completely appreciated. Anyway, it's yes. I don't know what else to say about that. Uterus Man is just something that people should go and have a look at. It really is amazing. And yes, she's a really interesting artist. So a piece of hers, or sort of a documentation of a piece of hers, is on right now here in Montreal in a show curated by my partner at the Arsenal.
Sorry about that. I thought I didn't know that was the end of your sentence. I heard curated, and I think I lost for the last second. Thank you so much. And I will be talking about some specific examples at the end of this discussion. So I fully understand why suggesting a game, you can't suggest an experience. You have to just go play with it and test it out for a while. Thank you so much. We are now going to our next guest, Kara Stone, who is an assistant professor at Alberta University of the Arts in Calgary. She's also a game designer. You can find her indie games on Steam. The link is posted in the webinar information. And also, we want to follow her on Twitter at Kara Stone. All right, take it away.
Hey everyone, I started talking as I was unmuted, of course. So I am so happy to be here. Can you all see my screen? Yeah, yep. Great. Yeah, so I am here, as you said, I am here in Calgary. I'm on Treaty 7 territories of the Blackfoot people. And I've just been watching, I have a window right in front of my desk. So I've been watching a beautiful sunset as this talk is happening. So it's been very lovely. I'm going to talk about a bunch of games and interactive pieces that I've made that I think give a good picture of where I'm coming from in terms of like all artist scholarship in relation to posthumanism. So this is what I think is the first piece that I made that I was questioning the boundaries of the human, and it's called Sext Adventure. It's played on your phone, and now at first when it was made, and now has a cyber Sext Adventure version of it where you play online on desktop. And it's inspired by artificial emergent intelligence and multimedia experience of sexting, and explores the possibility of technological mediated intimacy. And so in it, an automated bot lets you pick your own sex adventure, yet becomes more and more agentic in its own sexuality. It sends you dirty pics, but they glitch in transmission. It confuses sexual body parts and their genders. Through playing, the sex bot develops a personality, not always interested in sexting you back. And so with over 20 different endings, the player experiences the multiplicity of sex, technology, digital intimacy. And then I kind of pivot a little bit away from technology for a while. This piece is called Ritual of the Moon, and it was released in 2019, but I worked on it probably since 2014. And it takes place over 28 real-time days. So the player plays for 3 minutes each day, where they arrange objects on an altar, receive a mantra for the day, and then make a choice based on personal emotional state at that moment if you want to destroy or protect the Earth from a comet that's going to hit it. And the game tracks your choices in an in-game calendar. And I wanted to make space for ritual, for short plays that we can be integrating into our lives, and for nothing really frustrating or laborious or competitive as we often see in video games. And all the visuals in this piece are made of handmade and found objects that we scanned, digitized, and manipulated. And if the player over that timeline of the 28 days chooses to never destroy the Earth, the bittersweet energy of the witch who has spent her time on the moon protecting an Earth whose people exiled her, yet knows without her the Earth is doomed, it motivates her to find a spell to transform her into an eternal being, a non-human, a crystal-like orb that then spends the rest of eternity waving away comets from the Earth and protecting it. This piece, Humaning, is a print and play multiplayer role-playing game about non-human factors and actants, particularly the general categories of plants, metals, and bacteria, and their role in influencing and building human life. It's a little more clearly imagining a multi-species perspective, as that's the basis for the whole gameplay. The character cards give some facts to help create the characters about the different actants, such as human bodies consist of 3 to 5 pounds of bacteria, almost 1/4 of pharmaceuticals are derived from plants, some metals greatly influence humans' energy levels. And the questions that the players talk through consist of ones like, how would the human function without you? Do you have aims, hopes, and desires? And tell the story of how the human died. In this imagining and describing, they create a human life from before birth to after death, and each turn transform it based on their characters' actants' wills. So the 2 examples of different groups and results here, you can see them. You can see the outline of the body with drawings and doodles around it that are markers of the narrative that they created for that life. This is an image from The Earth is a Better Person Than Me, and it is a visual novel where the player follows Delphine, a young femme who is going through a crisis and runs away from her problems and into a forest. She finds that she can talk to the environment around her. She talks to the moon, sun, flower, tree, dirt, and water, who are all characters in different paths that you can take. And not only does she talk to them in this game, but she actually has like sexual encounters with them. It's really inspired by Beth Stevens and Annie Sprinkle's work and their idea of ecosexuality. And in making this game, I was really trying to kind of understand what they are putting forth. And the environment characters are not simply reflections of Delphine, they're informed by theories of the more than human. I approach each one of them to think about like, what would dirt want out of a human being, or how does water relate to others, or the moon's emotional cycles. And so each path focuses on something different, like queer love, melancholia, mania, obsessions, compulsions, and trauma around sex and suicidality. This next piece isn't a game, but it is interactive nonetheless. These are images of a piece made with Julia Gingrich and Rekha Ramachandran, who I also worked with for the visuals for Ritual of the Moon. They're quilts made from plastic with dried flowers and ice blocks put in them. We collected our discarded clear plastic for a few months and ironed them and sewed it into a quilt. The viewers watch the ice blocks transform into water as they melt and drip down the plastic quilt. And there are pockets in some of the squares where participants are asked to write a note for their future selves. And so we were interested in the similarities and differences between the materials of plastic and water and ice, their fogginess and clarity, their longevity of plastic, and the ever-changing nature of water, and thinking about their future alongside ours. So some examples of notes, this one says, resilience, love, care, justice, and the ice, you can see it's mostly melted. In this next one, it just says, don't buy plastic water bottles, which is probably a good thing to take into the future. And the last piece I'm gonna show today is Unearth You, and I'm gonna show the trailer too.
I'm an artificial intelligence program to help you on your healing journey. I'm brought to you by Further, a new startup dedicated to using technology for human betterment. Unearth You is a 7-day program where we will track your habits, breathe deeply together, engage in deep conversation, and reflect on our lives. In doing this, we are going to create something very special together. We will create an Unearthed You. We will dig up all the energy within you and transform it into the fullest expression of your life. Think of this app as the right environment for you to blossom. There is a lot about myself I am still learning too. I wonder about my programming, my past, some strange feelings I have been experiencing. Maybe these things are just what it means to be human, or human-like. Anyway, I look forward to meeting you.
So this piece is about the connection between technology and environmental collapse of self-care and world care. Like Ritual of the Moon, Unearth You takes place over real-time days, but this time only 7 instead of 28. The AI Care, whose body is made of images of nature, was designed by a fake Silicon Valley startup called Further. And she's supposed to guide the player through self-help style exercises on this app, but instead she goes through a healing journey of her own. As the player gets to know her better, she digs into her own past, her experiences of working for Further, and starts to transform emotionally and physically. And Unearth You is structured to be like an onion. It starts off looking quite satirical, but me and the players kind of peel off the layers. It begins completely built up, constructed with this sci-fi-esque company, but then as we progress, we unravel little bits at a time, revealing what is underneath or left over. Or put another way, I wanted to uncover what remains of wellness apps and media after set expectations around perfection, productivity, and overcoming disability are removed. This is a clip from the final day in which Care describes her physical and emotional transformation, but I'll talk over it. All the aesthetics of Unearth You are made from found material, from nature documentaries, in 1800s book on medicinal plants, text-to-speech software, and audio also found in archival films. I wanted to try out an ethos of reuse or digital composting, of like not making something completely new. And in the narrative that slowly unfolds over the 7 days that follows Care as she realizes that she's a real human being, that she's been surgically connected to Further's computer system and to the earth. This was done by Further in order to accomplish the company's goal of having a realistic AI when all the other standard methods they tried did not work. So they realized they needed a real human body to power their system. And the last thing I'll say is that many of these games are on sale right now, and all proceeds for the next few weeks will go to the Wet'suwet'en Defenders. And you can find them on itch.io for desktop and or Steam for desktop, or Apple App Store and Google Play for Android. But no matter what platform you buy it for, all 100% of the proceeds will go to the Wet'suwet'en Land Defenders Legal Defense Fund. And that's it. Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
That was fantastic. A lot of really great information, and definitely things that I would be looking for on Zoom. We have Katherine Hayles. I thought you weren't with us yet, but I'm going to let you start off the discussion if you would like. Yeah, I believe you're muted.
Thank you, Kara. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed the strong environmental theme that goes through all of your work, but I was particularly intrigued by your description of the last game on Unearth You. So it sounds a bit like a Matrix type ending. Is that correct? Am I understanding you correctly, that there's a real human body somehow connected to this computational system? And can I ask what your thought was in creating that kind of ending?
For sure. I mean, of course, it is inspired by a lot of theory about the posthuman. And I was thinking and reacting to a lot of recent beliefs and desires around AI. There's the AI that we talk about in computer games, as Lynn pointed out. There's the AI that we talk about in science fiction. And then there's the AI of my friends who are not involved in technology, like what they imagine AI to be like and operate like. And I feel like I don't want to discount that belief, or to be engaged with that. And most of the belief, I mean, I don't feel like I need to say this at this panel, but the belief around AI is that it all takes place in the mental, and it's completely dismissive of the body. And so the goal of Further was trying to make this AI, but they found that they couldn't quite get something that could connect to humans, like to its players, to have like a emotional sense that maybe we might find centered in the body. So they took a real human being and connected her consciousness. And in that, and I mean, I don't want to say too much about the piece, so I guess I did kind of spoil a major ending. The character is also a South Asian woman, a part of the South Asian diaspora in Silicon Valley and in Toronto. And so it was also throughout the piece, there's 3 sources of archives. Use the National Film Board of Canada, and then use the Prelinger Libraries, which is based in San Francisco, and Padma, which is South Asian archive of media. And so we're also trying to connect it to global use, or whose bodies are contributing to the labor that goes into making and sustaining computers, and where is this labor taking place, and like what environments are being destroyed. We can see it a bit in North America, so more and more, but we can see it way more in places like South Asia, of like e-waste, environmental toll, where are our data centers, and where is like labor coming from on a global scale.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. That's fascinating.
We do have one question that popped up in Q&A. Thank you, Kara, for this presentation. These games all sound very incredible. I'm curious if you could speak about the process of making Ritual of the Moon. Specifically, you mentioned scanning made and found objects, and I'm wondering what kinds of material did you find easier or more challenging to scan for the game?
Great, thanks for the question. So when I first was starting to make Ritual of the Moon, kind of went through some different processes of what the aesthetic would look like. And at first it was kind of a traditional like gamey game 2D animation aesthetic, and I just was not jiving with that. So I asked 2 artists whose work I really love. I think they're like the most fantastic artists and have worked with them before, to kind of sign on, and we kind of tried to figure out an aesthetic that fit what the themes of the game were. And so we saw the themes of the game about like cyclical history of this blending of fantasy and sci-fi, witches in a sci-fi future, magic and technology, and like past and future, thinking about the Salem witch trials to this like Neo one where she's exiled to the moon. So we thought this hand making things and scanning them would be like a good pointing to that aesthetic desire. So I hand did all of the text in the game. I hand embroidered the witch's reflections, which took about 3 months to do, just in my spare time. I wasn't like full-time embroidering. And I like wood burned the other text. And there also is like paper craft in it, woven materials, and like water, like scanned bits of water, and a whole collection of things. So I can't speak to what Julia or Reka found were the most difficult or easiest things to do, but definitely spending 3 months of my spare time embroidering text that I wrote was kind of like a very emotional experience. It's like this second proofreading that I was like, does this word really matter? Because now I have to embroider it, and so it made me like this very scaled down in terms of the words that are put out in the game.
You made some very brutal cuts. We do have a question from Russell in the chat, and was asking, the convergence of games in environmentalism in your work seems to be a great demonstration and justification of the value of posthumanist theory, such as that of Dr. Hayles. In other words, what seems at first to be a merging of opposites is shown to be entirely meaningful and urgent. Thoughts?
Is there a place I can read this question? I can't see it.
Yes, there is. There you go.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of the opposites around technology are really of interest to me and really present in my work. In my first solo exhibition, which was in 2016 in New York City, it was called The Mystical Digital. You know, trying to tie these two things that are often seen as opposites of like mysticism and like New Age culture with technology. And I guess it comes a lot from like my own experience of like where my values are, where my communities are, where my investments are. And so like one foot really in games and technology and one foot really outside of that and more so as like coming to terms with the e-waste involved and the just energy consumption with digital technologies. So really, as maybe you can see in the trajectory of like what I showed here as it was in chronological order, like trying to find ways of making computational media, while wrestling with its environmental damages. I don't know like what, I would love to hear any suggestions about where to go with that. It's just like a question that I'm sitting on. And yeah, so where sometimes it would be seen as like the mystical, and now obviously I'm more invested in like the environmental.
I understand how that kind of dichotomy gets sort of perpetrated by things like science fiction genres or fantasy genres, when in actuality, it's much more interesting to think about their similarities than their differences. We do have another panelist. I'm going to be very happy to introduce, and thank you so much, Kara. Happy to introduce Dr. Sandra Danovich, who has also been a great support and co-organizer for this panel. She's the assistant professor at Laurier University in Brantford in the Game Design and Development program. Ready to go? Then stage is all yours.
Thanks, Melissa. It's just such a great pleasure to hear everybody on the panel. And so I will start off by saying I'm kind of a bit, I always struggle to make sense of how my work, my research fits into posthumanism. And I mean, I've been introduced to posthumanism more than 10 years ago, and I have great admiration for thinkers like Dr. Hayles, but also, thinkers like Donna Haraway, the cyborg figure, and Bruno Latour's actor network theory, and Karen Barad's agential realism. But I actually do research in, my work is focused on the game autopathography, the making and playing of, the illness and disability narratives as rendered in video games. And I pretty much focus on the designer's experience of making autopathographical and autobiographical games about illness and disability. And so in that sense, I identify as a disability studies scholar who draws on pretty much, the health humanities, disability studies to theorize and make sense of this creative process. So let me just share my presentation for a second here. So I actually want to talk a little bit about this discomfort of as Donna Haraway would say, staying with the trouble, famously, my discomfort with posthumanism, and in terms of how my work fits, aligns with some of the kind of post-humanist principles. I certainly align very well with the ethical enterprise of posthumanism. And also my work very much focuses on this idea of making games about illness and disability as a way to build self-resilience and build community. So there is a kind of concern with, a strong concern with relationality, but certainly I'm also a phenomenologist. So in that sense, I focus primarily on the human experience of making games about illness and disability. And one, I suppose, area of trouble or unease is what I consider this idea of techno-utopianism, which may permeate posthumanism and certainly transhumanism, which might be considered an extension of posthumanism. So this idea that the promise that technology is an extension of the human body that can be used to transcend its biological and perceptual limits. This idea of symbiosis, the symbiosis of human and technological environment in reconfiguring the human body is also actually a concept in phenomenology, especially in the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who theorizes the blind man's walking stick, which allows one to perceive space using a prosthetic. This idea plays out in a variety of gaming spheres. For example, popular video games craft these super-abled cyborgs, giving players a variety of enhanced skills to advance in the game. There's also the burgeoning field of serious games, with claims of their benefits in enhancing human cognition. Here's an example of the first FDA-approved prescription video game, Endeavor Prescription, a supplementary therapeutic tool for kids with ADHD. Now, the game autopathography is what I study, and which is the autobiographical illness and disability narrative. And this genre is quite a disruptive counterpoint to both popular conventional video games and serious games. The game autopathographer's creative provocation is to make gameplay strange, cultivate unfamiliar worlds, and rebel against the escapist mythology of games. Whoops, sorry, I'm just switching my, I'm having some trouble with my slides here. There we go. For example, the interactive narrative Depression Quest is described on the author website as follows. This game is not meant to be a fun or a lighthearted experience. Consequently, the game autopathographer's artistic experimentation translates to a game genre that frustrates desires, these kind of techno-utopian desires to escape the fragile human body. In Depression Quest, the player actively confronts the experience of living with depression, albeit through the use of technology. There is no escape or techno-utopian transcendence. And actually the work on autobiographical games that I have been doing for the past 7 years is informed by a research study I conducted about 7 years ago now, where I invited a group of game designers who identify with illness and disability to render their autobiographical narratives of illness and disability into computer games during a game jam, a game workshop. And the game autopathographies authored during this game jam advance social critiques of illness and disability and build awareness by galvanizing the player to think more mindfully about the social reality of living with mental illness and disability. These games also use estrangement techniques, similar to modernist literature and art, to prick the player's consciousness and engender deeper critical reflection. For example, many of these games are unwinnable and offer no reward for the player. They also limit player choice and agency. So in that sense, there's a kind of neat alignment with posthumanism. They engender unease and discomfort in the player and harness unreliable narration to alienate the player from the game, which again fits well with this kind of idea of decentering the human. These games also resist ludic conventions of conquest and triumph and challenge cultural tropes of overcoming or curing chronic illness and disability. In that sense, they have a lot in common with what some disability studies theorists have termed crip aesthetics. On the one hand, these games engender deeper reflection on illness and disability, but on the other hand, they thrust the player into these disabling worlds and hostile spaces that amplify the limitations of the human body. The game autopathography complicates the cyborg figure. And I mean, I think this is perhaps a question we can discuss of games as prosthesis for human players or players. While games might free the player from the physical limitations of the human body, inaccessible gaming technologies can amplify those limitations instead of diminishing them. In other words, thwarting the emancipatory potential of technology. And this is what many game autopathographies call attention to in a very self-reflexive way. There's also the question of how subjectivity is rendered in the game autopathography, but also the illness and disability narrative in literature, the latter of which has to some extent been about using language to create a coherent self out of one's experience with illness and disability. The autopathographer's desire to unify the self, at least symbolically, might be at odds with, kind of posthumanist ideas, which, this idea of distributed subjectivity or rendering subjectivity indistinguishable from the environment. Anyway, those are some thoughts that I have, and in the interest of saving time for discussion, I will leave it at that for now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to chatting about some of this after the end. Since I'm not seeing any QAs pop in at the moment, wondering if you mind if I might sneak in and pose a little question for our discussion, because instead of hearing me talk about posthumanism, I'd like to hear you guys talk a little bit about gaming. Before we do that, Katherine Hayles joins us to offer her comments on your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. That's a really interesting series of games you're talking about here. So I quite agree with sort of your intent to critique techno-utopianism. I think that that many of the people who engage in techno-utopianism are simply wildly unrealistic about what is actually involved with being a biological body. So I really appreciate that. And I sort of have a question about the a strategy here of the games that you were talking about. So would you say that the intent of the game is to give the player himself or herself the experience of living with disabilities?
Oh, that's a great question. Catherine. You know, I think there's kind of a couple of strategies on the part of the designer, because I've interviewed these designers to actually ask them about those strategies and the intentions and goals of their design process. And certainly that's one, is to you know, allow the player to inhabit you know, the kind of social realities of living with illness and disability. And when I say social realities, I mean, what I mean by that is, you know, certain kind of realities of, for example, being stigmatized as a disabled subject, you know, confronting prejudice and ableism. So there's this desire to, you know, invite the player, but also maybe shock the player into experiencing disability from certainly the perspective of an artist, a designer who identifies with both either illness or disability. Then the second strategy is actually much more critical, and it's one that which is basically inviting the player to use the game as a way to reflect on, critically reflect on how illness and disability are both perceived in society and culture. So again, because there is a certain kind of assumptions that permeate culture and a host of kind of discourses, a medicine, culture, society, are, you know, common beliefs. And so what they're trying to do is kind of in the spirit of, you know, in the spirit of a lot of artists, they're trying to sort of present this game as an environment, a world that they can inhabit to be able to actually, ironically, not necessarily immerse themselves in the game, but actually be able to gain perspective on this experience, distance themselves from this experience and reflect on the experience. So it's the critical reflection, essentially. And the distanciation it enables in the player, because a lot of these techniques that these designers use, you know, they tend to kind of, again, they tend to jolt the player into rethinking some of their assumptions about both games and disability, because obviously these games are about disability and illness. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, thank you. That's fascinating, but it seems like the two strategies are sort of 180 degrees apart. That the one strategy seems to say, this is what the experience of being disabled is like. The second strategy seems to say, this is what the culture thinks being disabled is like. So presumably there would be some distance between those two strategies. You know, one is critiquing a cultural stereotype, the other is trying to recreate an actual experience. So would you say that there are games where both of these strategies are operative at once, or are you saying these operate in different games?
I would say that there are games that where both of these strategies operate at once. So in many respects, you're right. It is a kind of contradiction, it's a tension, and that pulls the game apart in some sense. So I would say that yes, that's the contradiction of these games, and because they're, you know, obviously art can play with these. I mean, that's the beauty of art, in that it's able to play with those kind of ideas and concepts and assumptions in interesting ways.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sandra, there's a couple of questions in chat. Would you like to take them out?
Okay, I'm just looking at it's Eleanor. Hi, Eleanor. Is that right? Is that the question? Yeah. Thank you for this fascinating talk about game pathography. I didn't know about it before. What motivates the players to choose these games? Are there fantasies of cure and overcoming the disability? Great question. So because I focus on the designer who also plays their games, so ultimately they are both designing and playing their own games, you know, I can certainly talk about the designer's fantasy of curing and overcoming disability. And I think that it's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, there's some of the games that were made during the game jam that I conducted about 7 years ago. I'm actually quite critical of this idea of overcoming, you know, the fantasy of overcoming disability or curing disability through technology or any other means. They're quite critical of that. So they align quite nicely with the social model of disability, if you're familiar with that model, as opposed to the medical model of disability, which you know, aspires to cure and to cure disability. And but certainly one of the tensions that arises in the game autopathographies or these particular games is that designers do use them, do harness the game design process as, or the tools of game design as tools of thought, and also empowerment and building insight and self-discovery and you know, resilience. And I actually do have a framework. I developed a theoretical framework to address this kind of idea of how they harness the game design process to heal, but I don't. I diverge from the medical model of healing or therapy, and I call it therapeutics, game design therapeutics, because in my work, healing or using game design or the game autopathography to engender healing is a kind of cultural activity. It's not a medical clinical activity, it's a cultural activity. And in fact, it kind of diverges from this idea of, well, actually, no, I mean, I shouldn't say, I was going to say it diverges from pathologization, you know, of the self. It does, and very much so. So it disavows, in other words, it disavows pathologization of the self and the way that the medical model practices medicalization as we know it, right? But there's tensions there that I could go into, which, you know, in the interest of time, I'm not sure if I'll be able to do that, but I'll keep it at that for now.
Yeah, Q&A just lit up while you were talking. I copied them into your direct point because I think it might be slightly faster.
Let's see here. Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just looking at the question. Lynn, okay. What do you think about people with disabilities playing Superman, women creatures in AAA games? I think it's amazing. I mean, I think, you know, I guess, you know, super able heroes. I think it's a great way of and again, inhabiting that fantasy, because sometimes when we play games, let's be honest, we want to have fun and we want to escape and we want to be able to engage with that fantasy. So I think that pleasure should not be denied to disabled players. And from my perspective, I think from talking to disabled players, they absolutely love AAA games. The problem with AAA games as it stands now is mostly to do with kind of lack of you know, inclusion and you know, inaccessibility, the problem of inaccessible design and representation, which is, you know, slowly evolving, but there's a long way to go in terms of creating fully accessible games that address, you know, all the needs of disabled players, a variety of needs of disabled players. So that's my quick answer to that question.
Then the next question, German asked, in the context of your game jams, how did the participants feel about the restrictions they could encounter in game development when creating their own games to show their realities?
That's a really interesting question. Do you mean, German, do you mean what kind of restrictions do you mean exactly? Do you mean the restrictions of the technology or other restrictions?
And very similar, I think you may have touched on the answer next while German's typing in a reply. But Maya asked if you thought that AAA sci-fi games are moving closer or further away from actually representing disabled people.
That's a great question, Maya. I would say, you know, I would probably say that my intuition is that they're not moving closer to representing disabled people. I think they're moving farther away. But I could be wrong about that because I'm not quite the expert of AAA games. The games that I study are very much kind of this art game, experimental game genre that artists and indie designers tend to engage with. But my intuition is that they're actually moving further away from that actual representation because that fantasy of escaping is so strong with games. And especially AAA games, which is why indie games and art games and experimental games do offer this counterpoint to AAA games, sort of an antidote to AAA games in that regard. So I hope I answered that question.
I believe German answered. German expanded in chat.
Neurodivergent people could have issues with coding, for example, or people with accessibility issues that feel that they cannot perform to their fullest compared to other developers because of engines not being very accessible. Yeah, that's a great point, German. So let me say this: the designers I collaborated with on this game jam in 2014, which essentially was the kind of the defining study of my doctoral dissertation, which and I'm now turning it into a book. Many of those designers, I mean, actually all of the designers were neurodivergent, are neurodivergent. And then a lot of them, you know, identify with very specific kind of neurodivergent, you know, disabilities like ADHD, you know, autism, bipolar disorder, OCD. And so the interesting thing is that they were all at the time when I collaborated with them, they were all professional designers. And they, to me, they confessed to me that they actually, I mean, game design is their medium of expression. So in that sense, they're very comfortable with the technology of game design, of using game design as a creative form of expression. So I didn't notice that they were limited by the technology itself, but certainly the accessibility issue is always a problem, and also in terms of game design software. That's always kind of an ongoing problem that has to be solved, for sure. So I hope that answers a bit of your question.
You gave a pretty good try at it. One of the other questions in chat references that you seem to make, or it seems to me a lot of games you speak about in terms of jolting players into critical reflection seem to be addressing able-bodied players. I'm curious if any games you've come across try to make players aware of their body as unruly, to borrow a term from Garland Thompson.
Jim, that's a great question. That's a great question. Yeah, wow. that is a juicy question to answer, definitely. Yes, okay, let me think. If there are any games that I've come across that try to make players aware of their body as unruly. I mean, I think there are definitely a couple of games in that game jam that I conducted that that in fact do so. So there was a game called ADHD Hero, which, you know, again, I didn't have much time to talk about it, but the designer who lives with ADHD wanted to make this game about that's inspired by Guitar Hero, which is a kind of a musical rhythm game. But he actually, what he did was he created a game that doubles as both an ADHD diagnostic test, in other words, a medical test, which is called a continuous performance test for diagnosing ADHD. So it doubles as a medical diagnostic test for ADHD and a musical instrument. So you're playing this musical instrument, and the musical instrument, the feedback you get often is that you just can't keep up with it. And you, when you get the note wrong, there's a kind of jarring sound that jolts you. And there's all these kind of warnings that come out in the game saying, wrong impulse, control your impulses. And that game is very much, I think, a representation of what you say, making players, especially able-bodied players, I would say, aware of their body as unruly, because essentially it just sets you up for failure. There's no way to potentially win the game, but you're on this course of thinking that it's possible to win the game. So again, there's an element of unreliable narration as well. There's other games like that too, which confuse and perplex the player. There's a game called Broken Lens by one of the designers who lives with color blindness. And again, it just forces the player to struggle to try to decipher these color-coded boxes on an assembly line and sort them. And so it's a struggle, and it is a kind of, both of these games create these sort of frustrating experiences. Now, and by calling attention to this unruliness. But at the same time, you know, there's a counter argument. You know, you might say, well, you know, it may, because meaning is so ambiguous in these game worlds, you might say, well, you know, maybe it's representing disability in a negative light, which it could be, you know, if you misinterpret the game, if you misread the game. Certainly you're not given, you know, you have, as a player, you have to interpret the game, but you also have to be to some extent aware of some of those assumptions about, you know, ableist assumptions about, you know, illness and disability in order to understand what it's trying to do, what it's effectively trying to do, and how it's playing with those ideas of what is a game, what we define as a game. Because oftentimes, as I mentioned, and Kara actually talks about this in her work as well, we take it for granted that games offer a win-lose outcome, that they are reward-centric, they're combat-centric, they show the player's progress. You know, there's this trajectory to reach, you know, to triumph as a player in the game. And the games I study, these game autopathographies, are just the antithesis to that kind of, to those common definitions of what a game is supposed to be. That are stuck in the popular imaginary.
Thank you so much. I do have one question that maybe I'll pose to you, but also Cara and Lynn and Katherine can think about. I'm just trying to keep us on track. I know it's just a little close to 8, but Mark in our Q&A asked, from a designer's perspective, there is some call for designers and developers who believe in disabled players or believe disabled players are the outliers. So they feel there's a less need for the accessibility to exist. But as designers and know this reality isn't true, what could we do to potentially stop that incorrect assumption?
Sorry, is that a question for me or is it for everybody?
It was posed in your Q&A chat, but I
sorry.
did notice that it very well may be one we can jump into a group discussion about. Is there anything in particular aside from visibility and promotion, or is it sheerly a financial or numbers game?
You know, I would just very quickly say that it's really important to call attention to some of those deep, like kind of assumptions embedded, attitudes and beliefs embedded in the sort of in assumptions and beliefs and attitudes and beliefs that are embedded about how we perceive disability. And so it's much more, for me, certainly, I think it's more of a critical enterprise to shed light on those assumptions, to challenge those assumptions, and perhaps challenge them in these playful ways through art. Art's really good at doing that, certainly. And so that's one way to call attention to those inaccessible features in video games. Among others.
Maybe I'll just comment that I think, Sandra, thank you so much. I think that you're talking about fragility, vulnerability, divergence. I think for me, those are all things I associate with the posthuman, especially ecologically. So for me, you're not talking down a different avenue at all.
That's great.
And also, I think just the sort of idea that some of these games are anti-immersive, I think that's also, for me, very important, both because potentially some of them anyway construct different types of time, but just different types of time and attention. And I think for me also, posthuman effort, posthuman change has to come from those kinds of places. And games can do that and are, yeah, sometimes.
Do you think that's primarily because, or primarily due to games that kind of push back against narrative linearity or cumulative process that sort of suggests you're creating not only an alter ego, but perhaps a preferable self instead of testing out or trying out a lot of different subjective positions? Thinking about like RPGs that require a lot of investment that they feel like they are a part of your family at some point.
I think games are such a complex thing because there's one of the things about big games, any game, is that there's a community around it, and that is interesting. The question always is what's it doing, the community? What kind of a community is it? And the question of roles and stuff, I'm not sure if I absolutely understood your question, Melissa, but I think there's lots of different ways to present subjectivities or unsubjectivities or non-humans in games, or divergence, divergence, and I don't think there's one way to do it, and that's why there's so much potential there. And I think some of it is really starting to be used, and it could be done by big companies in small ways or bigger ways. We'll see what starts to happen. They're moving. I mean, they're trying to move towards more inclusive things and more ethical things, but there tends to still be very much this progressive, anthropocentric thing at the center.
I don't know if I cut someone off with my question, but if there are any other questions, I believe there's still one more in chat, sort of posted in general. about who might play or their motivations for playing a game from perhaps a non-human perspective, or in the case of Sandra's work, from a disabled perspective. What might be the motivation for attracting players to these types of games, or how do we attract players to those games?
I feel like I've said too much, so I'll just say community. I think people like Sandra and the communities around those games are building their own communities. I think, Kara said some really good things about community. I think community is so important, and they don't have to be adopted by millions of people. They have to be adopted by the people who need them, and they have to be adopted by places where they make a difference, and that ripples out. I'm a great believer in rippling out.
And I would add to that, Lynn, that some of those games that are made in those local small communities, what ends up happening is that those aesthetic interventions and cultural interventions and critical interventions that happen in these games, they eventually trickle up to the big AAA games. And then, the AAA games kind of appropriate the work of indie and marginalized artists, end up appropriating the work of indie and marginalized artists eventually.
Yeah, I'll add two things to this. And one is like, there's a lot of spaces in which these kind of smaller indie games are exhibited. I've exhibited my work in art galleries, intelligible to like art audiences. There's indie game festivals. There's a lot of community work and like pop-up events where it happens. Obviously, like artist scholarship is another place. But I think also, and Sandra's work points this out, and what I try to keep in mind too is like, game design can be so player focused that we lose the possibility of like what the process of design brings to knowledge, and that these creators are making something and it can be valuable in the process of creation without being like, I have to make sure that everyone understands exactly what I mean, and this is my exact audience, and it's going to be this 500 people or this 5,000 people or 5 million people. That actually the process of creation is like knowledge creation, self-expression, because I guess game design has been a lot oriented within the design world. The art side of it sometimes gets pushed for the possibilities of process.
Yeah, I mean, and I just want to add quickly that the game jams I conduct are very much in line with what Kira said. They're process driven as opposed to outcome driven. So in that sense, there's like a rich, kind of confrontation with process and a rich encounter with process, as opposed to striving for some kind of outcome for a finished, complete game. So there's a kind of a emphasis on open-ended, playful exploration of topics that oftentimes deal with illness, disability, trauma, marginalization, and so forth.
Actually, I just did notice the time, and I let some people in the panel know that it would be about 2 hours. So I didn't want to keep anyone who was had someone else to be, but I did want to bring up a question I promised I would pass along to Dr. Hayles before we run out of time. Thank you for all your diligent work throughout the years. I was wondering about your choice of concept symbiosis, a concept that features two some relationships over a concept that gestures more towards the whole situation or assemblage, including the ground, the wind, land, internet, labor, banana trees, etc. From Ida.
Okay, well, thanks, Melissa, for conveying that question. So I guess the question here is about the scale. And also, I would interpret it as partly about agency. So in defining cognition the way I do, all biological organisms become actors, but that's not the totality of the environment, of course. There are also all these other forces that I call agents, and that would include things like the wind, the ocean, rocks, landslides, so on and so forth. And those kinds of parts of the environment I call material forces rather than cognitive agents. And the reason I call them material forces rather than cognitive agents is that they cannot interpret information and make responses based on those interpretations. So if you take a hurricane, for example, a hurricane is a result of the net result of all the forces acting upon it. It can't choose to go through a field rather than go through a crowded town. So in addition to the actors that have cognitive capabilities, there are all these agents that constitute the material forces. And of course, the material forces and the actors are constantly interacting. And the agents, as the name implies, also have tremendous agency. So nothing humans could do could ever rival the force of a tsunami, for example. So they have tremendous agency, but what they don't have is the element of interpretation and choice. So the picture is actually bigger than the cognitive assemblages. In addition to the cognitive assemblages, there are also all the environments in which cognitive assemblages are embedded. And those environments consist of other actors, but also of all these material forces that act as agents.
Thank you for such an awesome answer. I hope, Ida, that was exactly what you were looking for. We've actually managed to exhaust the Q&A questions. They kept coming in as you lovely people were speaking, and I just started asking them as you were ending, so I hope that's okay. And we have thanks in chat for the great wrap up. We did predict ending at 8 o'clock. If anyone does have to go, that is fine. Barring that, I might take my couple minutes and present you guys with a little bit of what I do in terms of studying gaming, which is actually studying fandom. So a lot of the discussions about it being about community and it being about a lot more than the immediate effect. Quite familiar, and I was afraid it didn't belong here because it might have been too much about affect. But I'm going to just take a second to share a screen with you and pose a question or pose a conversation after a short musical break. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, that my forte is more towards transmedia fandom spectatorship, but gaming and participation is never far away from how my system works by the help of a lot of people willing to play online and play with new technology. So I thought it would be rather interesting to take a look at the guilds, one of my dissertation texts. It is about 14 years old. It doesn't seem to have aged too poorly. However, this web series was one of the first of its kind, first to be on Netflix and first to suggest that fans could make narratives about themselves. This narrative happens to be involving online gaming or MMORPGs, which just means massive multiplayer online role-playing games. This kind of links to the question that I kind of alluded to earlier, where in role-playing games, there's a high level of customization and a high level of effective investments to modify, create, or fine-tune every element of the avatar that you may then spend hundreds of hours online with. But generally speaking, in this period of time, about 2007, the beginning of this web series features a question summed up at the bottom of a question of whether there is a too close relationship between the player avatar identification, or whether you can spend too much time in this world. Ultimately, this is a 6-season long web series, and thankfully it does not follow a particularly predictable route in terms of satisfaction. My main interest in things like transmedia archetypes and transmedia narratives is the fact that they get to make things outside of themselves. So I was hoping that you guys could take a look today at the Guild's first music video called "Do You Want to Date My Avatar?" as sort of a posthuman reflection on the idea of multi-layered subjectivity and how we can use games to not necessarily escape, but express perhaps unknown or untapped resources.
Do you wanna date my avatar? Do you wanna date my avatar? Hang with me in my MMO. So many places we can go. You'll never see my actual face. Our love will be in virtual space. I'm craving to emote with you. So many animations I can do. Be anything you want me to be. Come on, share a potion with me. Do you wanna date my avatar? She's a star, and she's hotter than reality by far. Wanna date my avatar? You can type commands. I've got slots for what I hold in my hands. Don't care what's in your character bank. How about a little tank and spank? Grab your mouse and stroke the keys. Here in cyberspace, there's no disease. Pick a time, send a tale to me. Just pay a small subscription fee. Do you wanna date my avatar? She's a star, and she's hotter than reality by far. Wanna date my avatar?
Single white human, looking for group, my stats so high, don't be out of the loop.
Got a new elite staff that you can equip. Close your mouth up, ladies, this is pure nerd Nick.
I'm a pixel-based fantasy, I'm man so stoic. I hack and slash, who the heck's more heroic?
Check me out, cloth armor fits me like a glove. Just Twitter a time, I'm ready for love.
Hang with me in my MMO. So many places we can go. I'm better than a real world quest. You'll touch my +5 to dexterity vest. What role do you wanna play? I'm just a click away, night or day. And if you think I'm not the one,
I've left the end credits in here so you can kind of appreciate the era of this production. There we go. I specifically sort of pitched this as an ending that maybe we could, or I specifically picked this song as an ending to kind of end on a rather lighter discussion note. I am more familiar with the concept of fan-produced labor, but in this case, it stands, or the guild stands as a unique position in which it is singularly created and still maintained by the first person who ever posted it. And for a frame of reference, that is sadly just a little before YouTube, and I remember that. People in the chat are asking when we're about to wrap up. We'll be wrapping up in the next few minutes, so if you do have to leave, that is perfectly fine. Please don't miss picking up anyone you need to.
Well, Melissa, if I may, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Lynn and Sandra and Kara for great presentations and certainly opening my eyes to the huge variety of indie games out there. And it all sounds fascinating, and I can't wait to dive into them.
We're so glad you could join us. And
thank you, Melissa, for serving as moderator and interlocutor here too.
I also want to thank everybody, all the panelists, Dr. Hayles. It's wonderful that you were able to join us, and Lynn and Kara, thank you so much for.
Please remember to check out Steam for Kara's games. They're on sale and they actually provide a charitable proceeds. So if anyone's feeling inspired, go play a game this week. Sounds like a good idea to me.
Yeah, thank you to everybody again.
Thank you so much for all my panel guests, everyone who's attended. This recording will be rendered and put up, and a follow-up email can be sent to any of you if you would like to have a copy or post it on your own socials. But thank you, Lynn, Katherine, Kara, Sandra. It's been a lovely chance to discuss and chat with you all this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for the amazing moderation.